This is note taker 9 on diffusion, osmosis, and active transport. So far within our cell unit, we had note taker 7 that talked about the cell theory and the history of the discovery of cells, along with their structures and the function of each of those structures. Note taker 8 concentrated on how cells reproduce to make more cells so that we can grow and we can repair injuries. This note taker 9, is going to be dedicated to processes that allow things to move into and out of our cell so that we can have our life functions occur. For cells to be able to perform their functions, they need to use energy. But to get this energy, they have to take in raw materials, and those materials will be broken down to release the energy. And cells must also be able to eliminate waste products. If we can't get rid of the waste products, they end up poisoning us. So in note taker 7, we talked about the cell membrane being the bouncer of the cell. It forms a barrier between the inside and the outside of the cell, and the cell membrane is what gets to decide what can come into the cell and what has to leave the cell. So in the processes that we're going to talk about on this note taker, the cell membrane is going to be the vital cell part for any of these processes to happen. So for things to move in or out of the cell, it's going to happen by one of 3 processes. The first is diffusion, the second is osmosis, and the third is active transport. Within this note taker, we're going to talk about how each of these processes function and what can be moved with each of them. Now, for things to move through the cell membrane, it must be permeable, which means there will be openings throughout the cell membrane, almost like tiny little doors. These are called pores. And whatever we need to get into the cell or whatever needs to leave the cell must enter or leave through one of these pores. The first process we're going to talk about on the note taker is diffusion. Diffusion is the process by which molecules of a substance, like salt or food coloring or air freshener, they're going to move from an area of a high concentration to an area of low concentration. What that means is they're moving from where there's a whole lot of them, and the molecules are going to bump into each other, causing them to spread out into an area where there is less of them. So in class, I will be demoing diffusion using food coloring and air freshener. The air freshener demo, if you recall from class, I'm going to spray that in one corner of the classroom, and we're going to see how that air freshener spreads across the classroom so that everyone can smell it. So if you look at the picture below, you'll see that the molecules are all starting in one corner. That's the high concentration. And then over time, they're going to spread out evenly throughout the room. So they went from an area where there was a lot in the corner, and they spread out to the rest of the room where it was low concentration, or in this case, no air freshener at all. You'll see the same with the food coloring demo. I will have a cup of water, and I'll put 1 drop of food coloring. I don't need to shake it, I don't need to stir it. Over time, that drop of food coloring will diffuse through the water, and all of the water will then be colored. In this diagram, it's showing how food moves from outside of a cell to the inside of a cell. So the picture's a little confusing, so I'm going to try to explain it to you. Each column, there's 3 columns. You'll notice the first column, there's lots of blue dots at the top, nothing at the bottom. The middle column, you have lots at the top, and you start to see them move through this gray barrier. And then the last column, there's equal amounts of blue on the top and the bottom. So these different columns are going to represent how time goes on. The gray barrier in the middle is going to be our cell membrane. The top half is outside of the cell. The bottom half is inside of the cell. So in the first column, when we start, as we digest our food and nutrients are carried to our cells, we have all these nutrients outside of the cell, nothing inside of the cell. But over time, they're moving from a higher concentration, where there's a lot of them, across the cell membrane to inside the cell where there's not as many. So they're going from a high concentration to a low concentration. And they will keep crossing the cell membrane until you have the last column where it's equal on the outside and the inside. Now, if we think about what's going to happen in the future, make a prediction of what's going to happen next, as our mitochondria that are inside our cell break down the little blue dots on the inside part of the cell, that means the number of blue dots is now going to go down, so more blue dots will move in to take their place. So there will always be food moving into our cell because our cell is going to be constantly using it up. So to sum up the picture, if there are more food molecules outside of the cell, they're going to move into the cell through the cell membrane to where there are less. The same is going to happen with the waste products, but we're going to be the opposite direction of the food. As the food is being used up and broken apart for energy, waste products are being made inside of our cells. So there's more waste inside the cell, and that will move through the cell membrane to the outside of our cell, where then that waste will travel to our bloodstream and then be taken to our kidneys, where it will be filtered out and removed from our body. So waste products are going to move from inside the cell, where there's lots of them, to the outside of the cell, where there's less. Now, we're talking about things that move from areas of where there's a lot, high concentration, to where there's a little bit, low concentration. If that's the case with all these substances, what keeps all the organelles that are really tiny from leaving the cell? The cell membrane, actually, when we talked about it on Note Taker 7, it's the bouncer of the cell. It determines what's allowed to come in and what has to leave. So with that, the cell gets a special term called semi-permeable, or it can also be called selectively permeable. What this means is that the openings of the cell choose what goes in and what goes out. So they are selective about what they let in or what they let leave. They're going to let good things in. So if we look at the animal cell, the good things would be food, water, and oxygen. And they're going to have carbon dioxide, which is a waste product to the cell, along with other waste products. They're going to allow those to leave the cell. But if one of our other little tiny organelles tries to leave, those doors, the cell membrane, the pores, which are the little doors of the cell membrane, are going to say, no way, you can't go anywhere. Now, diffusion described the movement of substances. However, the most important substance that we need to move into our cell is water. So water gets its own special name for its movement, and that is going to be osmosis. Osmosis is a type of diffusion, but it's the diffusion of water into and out of the cell. So during osmosis, instead of molecules of a substance moving, it's actually going to be water molecules moving from a place where there's more water molecules to a place where there's less water molecules. So it's going from a higher concentration of water to a lower concentration of water. and this movement is going to allow the cell to keep from drying out. So, an example of osmosis is if I were to place one of your cells into a glass of salt water. There would actually be more water molecules inside of your cell and less in the glass because you have all this salt taking up space in the water of the glass. So since there's more water inside your cell than in the same size space in the cup, water molecules will actually leave your cell, causing your cell to actually shrink. If too much water leaves your cell, the cell will actually dry up and die. This is the reason why no matter how bad your or how thirsty you are, if you are ever trapped on a deserted island and all you have is salt water, do not drink it. Because if you drink salt water, it's actually going to pull the water you already have in your cells out. You're going to dehydrate faster, and that means you're going to die faster. So there are ways that you can actually evaporate fresh water out of salt water, and you can make it drinkable. The picture at the bottom of this slide here, you'll notice is a cup of water with salt water on one side, fresh water on the other, and in the center, that red line is the semi-permeable membrane, sort of like the cell membrane. Fresh water is actually going to move from the right side of the cup to the left until both sides have an equal number of water molecules. So the side of the cup, the left side, will actually look like it has a higher level of water. This picture represents a cell. The top, or I should say the first picture on the far left, is what a normal red blood cell looks like. The liquid in our blood that it travels through is the perfect mixture of materials and water. So that way, when our red blood cell is floating through our blood vessels, it should look like a perfect little raft. Now, if I take that cell and drop it into salt water, then you're going to get the middle picture, where water is actually going to leave the cell and the cell will shrink up. But if I take that same cell and I drop it in a cup of fresh water, one that has only water molecules and nothing else, then the cell is going to take in water and it's going to blow up like a balloon. That would be represented by the last picture. The same would happen if I put a raisin in the water. If I took a raisin and put it in a cup of fresh water and left it for a few days, eventually water from the cup would move into the raisin and it would look like a little swollen, gross little thing floating around in the water. It's not going to be a grape again. It will never go back to being a grape, but it will look like a fat, swollen raisin. One of the most important things about diffusion and osmosis is that they require the cell to use no energy to happen. Because it's going from a high concentration to a low concentration, it's almost like riding a bike down a hill. You're going from the high part of the hill to the low part of the hill. You can just let the bike roll down the hill. You don't have to pedal. You don't have to use any energy. So cells love diffusion and they love osmosis because they don't have to use any of their own energy for those to happen. However, sometimes our cell might have a lot of stuff in it, but it needs more. For this to happen, we need to talk about the next process, which is active transport. The best example I can give you for active transport is I want to buy a gaming system. The gaming system costs $200. I have $180, which means I already have a lot, but I don't have enough. And one of you, my students, has $20. And I really, really, really need that $20 to buy my gaming system. So I have 180, which is a lot more than you have at 20. So I have a higher concentration of money, but I still need more. So to get the $20, which is a low concentration, into my pocket, which has $180, a high concentration, I'm going to have to use energy to talk you out of that money. So this occurs sometimes in cells. They already have a lot of stuff, so they already have a high concentration, but they need more. And they need it to move from an area where there's not a lot of it. So this is now like riding a bike up the hill. We're going from the low end of the hill and have to move to the high end of the hill. To get there, we're going to have to pedal and use energy. So, cells have to use active transport and are going to have to utilize energy for this to occur so that they can get the important life substances that they need. A couple of examples where active transport happens in living things. The first is inside of our kidneys. I talked about how waste product diffuses out of our cells into our bloodstream so that it can be filtered out. The only problem is that our kidneys already have a lot of waste product in them waiting to be filtered out. So for the low concentration of waste products in our blood to go into the high concentration of waste products in our kidney, our bodies have to use active transport. Another example are ocean-dwelling creatures. Ocean-dwelling creatures have to have a chemical called iodine in them. They already have a lot, but they need to get more from the surrounding water. So to get the little bit of iodine from the water into the sea creature that already has a lot, this is going to need to use active transport, and the cells will have to use energy to get it there. In this last picture, it's a representation of what it would look like for active transport to happen. The picture on the left shows you those plus signs being the chemicals that need to move. The line in the center, the black line in the center, is the semi-permeable membrane. So the materials from the left, even though there's a low concentration, only a few of them, they need to move to the right side of the picture where there's a lot. So to go from low to high, the cell would have to use energy. On the right side is a picture of a special pump or area that we have on our cell membrane that allows active transport to happen. It actually uses energy to move substances in and out of the cell. So we've now discussed the structures of a cell, we've discussed how cells reproduce, and we've discussed how things move in and out of cells. The final cell note taker, which will be cell note taker 10, will actually talk a little bit about cellular organization. Don't forget to do the 3-question assessment that follows the video.